The Notebook on Cities and Culture mailing list fires off regular updates about the show, and you, my friends, can subscribe. Visit colinmarshall.org and click Mailing List in the upper right column for details. Season 3 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. How does it feel knowing that, we're two guys sitting here in our late 20s, working on our various projects. I'm doing mine as we speak. We're promoting yours. How does it feel knowing there is a dictator, the same age as us, in control of an East Asian hermit kingdom?
It does make me self-conscious about my lack of accomplishments in this world.
Oh, really?
It certainly does make me insecure about my professional, both ambitions and my accomplishments at this stage in my life. I know. As far as we know, he's maybe about our age. And he's in charge of a country worth of 24 million people. I think that any of our accomplishments probably pale in comparison.
The subject, of course, is Kim Jong-un. The film we're talking about today is called Juche Strong, and the director is sitting here with me. His name is Rob Montz, and it is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall. We're here in Koreatown recording an interview because as you hear this, I'm going to strategically post it. As you hear this, an Indiegogo campaign will be running to fund the completion of this documentary on North Korea, on, to some extent, Kim Jong-un, on the question of, tell me if this is right or not, the question of why the North Korean people continue to believe in North Korea despite having every reason not to.
There's very little way that I could improve upon that as a marketing pitch, I'll tell you that. Yeah, so the film itself is done. It's a 20-minute long documentary that specifically focuses on the propaganda apparatus in North Korea, and in ways that I think are wholly anomalous and exceptional among the entire body of North Korean documentaries. It takes the propaganda seriously. It's not dismissive. It doesn't assume that it's adolescent. It doesn't assume that it's intellectually bankrupt. It really tries to delve into the fact that the North Korean people, despite the fact that they seem so strange to us, do in fact have a worldview, a very particular worldview that is shaped by the message and the narratives that are told to them by the ruling Kim family. And so I think the subject itself is wholly unique, and I think the way that it's crafted really speaks to that question of why is it that this country continues to exist, despite the fact that it has a completely broken economic system. However, it's done, but as you might know yourself as an amateur filmmaker, the costs of licensing archival footage are insane. They tend to go by the per second amount, and so while the film is finished, there are certain frames that have massive watermarks or time code stamps on them, and it turned out there was no way that I could try to contextualize that as a move of a true auteur. It just looks distracting. So I need to purchase the actual straight-up footage before the film itself can be released in the world. And the other pitch I would make for the film, and we're going to direct every single listener to the Indiegogo campaign website, and there you'll get to see the trailer. You'll get to see me talk about in more depth sort of the particulars of the propaganda apparatus and what I think I've discovered. But also another reason to support it, particularly for listeners of this podcast, is you would be supporting kind of the innovative, ground up, sort of do-it-yourself media that I think is becoming increasingly possible because of the lowering of the cost of the technology and the equipment, and then also the expansion of your ability to distribute it to eyeballs all across the world. So this film is very much a product of those two forces in combination. I didn't go to film school, and a lot of it was do-it-yourself, but if you like the notion of that kind of media, the stuff that is done wholly outside the traditional institutions of media distribution, this is certainly a project to support. And the chief benefit of that kind of media is that it doesn't get diluted and made more mediocre by those same institutions of traditional media distribution.
Indeed.
Right.
Now, what were the questions about North Korea that motivated you to throw yourself into the schlep of DIY media? besides, why does North Korea keep going?
I think I came at it. I initially thought of the film I wanted to do when I started this project about 2 years ago was actually about their World Cup team, as I think I've told you, because they participated in the World Cup in 2010 for the first time in something like 40 years. And there was sort of a natural story to be told there. And I actually came at it with the very specific perspective that I now, with this film, am trying to actively combat, right?
Yes.
So
a little more about the perspective you switched on there.
I switched on it the more I went there myself this summer. Mm-hmm. And so insofar as a Westerner can get a true sense of the people there, I got a true sense, which again is a limited sense, interviewed something like 20 to 25 of the top-notch North Korean academics, and then have immersed myself in the literature about the country. That whole process really dramatically shifted the way that I think about this country. And hopefully this film can be like a nice, quick, efficient, like sniper shot for the average viewer to do the same thing for them. Mm. And I think, to put it as simply as possible, the shift is, back in 2010, you perceive North Koreans either as these sort of hopeless serfs trapped in this incredibly Stalinistic, domineering political structure, or you just completely dehumanize them. They're just seen as completely robotic, and you don't appreciate
insectoid, perhaps?
Yeah, and it's strange, and you see these shots of the military, and it's perfectly coordinated, and it becomes very, very easy to sort of deny them their individual human subjectivity. But then when you dip into the literature, it turns out that, and particularly when you go there, you can't be in denial of the fact that they're, in many ways, not that different than the average person you would find in Koreatown.
Right. Where we sit right now, there's potentially someone you could, other than they're better fed here, I would imagine. But the core psychology is not like a world apart.
It's not. And specifically the things about their worldview that are different than ours, like thinking that Kim Il-sung is a divine figure, which is probably, there's few and far between in the United States culture, people that are like that. It is like the deeper structure of it, the deeper structure of their worldview and sort of the religiosity and the political identity they have shares a lot with the sort of basic structure of the average American's political and religious identity. That it's more kind of the top level phenomenon that seems so different, but it's actually based in these core psychological truths that are shared among all people. And actually, for me, that makes the country even more fascinating.
Right, because it's not it's not just, oh, that's alien, that's bizarre, I can't comprehend it, so we'll put it aside. It becomes something that you then have like an obligation to comprehend, because it comes from the same place as all of us.
Right, you have to confront the fact that these are human beings like you and I are, and you ultimately, in the most hypothetical sense, have to come to terms with the fact that, well, would you be any different if that's the world that you were born into? Right.
I want to talk more about those discoveries more about the trip to Pyongyang, of course. But first, you mentioned talking to like 25 of the most prominent academics on North Korea, and give me a sense of the landscape of analysis you find there. Like we hear the voice of both Bruce Cummings and Brian Reynolds Myers, two very well-known scholars of Korea in Juche Strong, and they are sometimes regarded as like opposites on the spectrum of North Korean opinion. Do you think that's actually true? Do you think there is a spectrum in that way?
So yeah, it's the two of them have had, insofar as you can have a very public tiff in the North Korean scholar community, they've had a very public tiff. And I think that the bits and pieces of the stuff from them that I use in the film it can still fit together as a coherent whole. And we can get into what specifically are their differences when it comes to the particular components and facets of the propaganda. Right. But on the bigger question, the more important question of, is the ideology that is crafted by the ruling regime in North Korea powerful and intoxicating to a large slice of the population? And in part, is that worldview and that narrative part of the reason that this country has defied international predictions for 2 decades and not collapsed? Right. On that key question, they absolutely are in agreement. And I think that revelation of that observation alone, it would be enough to shock a couple people. I think the average amateur American observer of North Korea doesn't get that. They think that this is a country that's always on the brink of collapse, and that it's just an incoherent, chaotic, adolescent mess when it comes to their narrative and their mythology that they're told by the Kim regime.
So the points of disagreement, at least with those two, come more on the actual mechanics of the propaganda machine in North Korea.
Right. So basically it's whether or not you take Juche, which is the founding philosophy of the country, seriously. I mean, in short, Bruce Cummings does, and he thinks that it vaguely translates to self-reliance. And the reason why you would have self-reliance be the core of your philosophy is that the Korean people, right before Kim Il-sung took power, had been under the rule of brutal dictatorships for many, many centuries, but specifically a couple decades worth of brutal Japanese imperialist rule. And the sense is that time kind of left an indelible mark upon the Korean psychology, and that if you're Kim Il-sung and you're trying to pitch yourself to the Korean people, the thing that they're going to find most compelling is going to be in direct opposition to what they just experienced. So the idea of a Korean people that are autonomous, that are non-dependent, that have kind of shaken off the shackles of the Japanese or the Yankee yoke and have established an autonomous, self-actualized nation is going to be really powerful for people. B.R. Myers thinks that Juche is a sham doctrine, and he has some compelling evidence insofar as if you read the founding Juche texts, and I got a couple of those when I was in North Korea, they really are intellectually incoherent gobbledygook. As he says, it reads like a graduate student who's just trying to pad out their dissertation with 10 or 20 extra pages, and they're repeating themselves over and over again. Right. And he thinks Juche is they only did that because the Japanese imperialists also had like a foundational philosophy, and they were just trying to mimic them in a very superficial sense. He thinks it's much more based on the notion of racial purity and the Korean people being a morally exceptional, racially pure community, and that the Kim family sells themselves to the Korean people by saying, well, we're in a unique position to care for you and to protect you against these sort of racially polluting forces that are chiefly represented by Americans and by the Japanese.
Listeners may remember on this show's predecessor, The Marketplace of Ideas, we had B.R. Myers talking about his book, The Cleanest Race, and talking about how he thinks that Juche is yes, just a deliberately built quicksand trap for intellectuals who try to understand North Korea. They just get mired in it. And I wonder, given the emphasis on self-reliance, it seems fairly ironic, no, that they are in fact a super-dependent country, right? So the film posits in part that like the propaganda apparatus being very smartly constructed is part of the reason that this country still exists, but undoubtedly part of the reason they also exist is because of financial and political support from China, right? They also have like a huge, apparently like a thriving American counterfeit dollar bill manufacturing, and that their fake $100 bills are like the best on the planet. So, and that obviously depends upon commerce with the outside world, with the more seedy characters of the outside world. I mean, I think there's an irony there, but I think for the average North Korean, there's a plausible sense of we've established an independent, economically viable country. On the ground, it feels that way to them.
I never specifically asked that question, but my sense is after going there, and again, you have to always caveat any grand pronouncements about the country. My sense is, and this actually fits more with the B.R. Myers theory about the country, the Stalinist and the communist and the top-down command and control economic stuff is really, it's less about the need to continue like this Stalinist political legacy, and that was more just a means to an end of trying to have economic independence. That's much more about that than it is about having some great affiliation with the Soviet project.
There's a term used in Juche Strong, superficial communism. You find that an accurate description?
Yeah, and specifically, so I talked to B.R. Myers briefly after I got back from North Korea, and he'd asked me, have they removed the picture of I think it was the portraits of Lenin or portraits of Stalin that were on the main square, or maybe they were portraits of Marx. And there's this big square, and on one side there's Kim Il-sung, and on the other there used to be these sort of grand Soviet communist thinkers, and they weren't there anymore when I went there this summer, so they're gone. Right. And that actually fits with a broader project in which they've been systematically scrubbing away any mentions of the Soviets. So they used to be defined as a communist country in their constitution. They aren't anymore. And all of that lends itself to the idea that it's sort of like a shell, like they kind of have Stalinist government institutions and bureaucratic institutions, but it's much more... The much more important point is the idea of Korean exceptionalism and nationalism, and that's the profound animating force behind the propaganda.
Now, I can't resist anymore. You went to Pyongyang. You were in North Korea. How does an American get there? It seems easier than getting to Cuba. More expensive, but easier.
So whenever I tell people, I want people to be impressed by the fact that I went there, and I kind of want them to have misconceptions about what it takes to get there. I want them to have this image of me with like a breathing reed under a pond as some North Korean soldiers scurry by looking for the Yankee intruder. It's actually incredibly easy, and the reason why I'm so emphatic about this point is I think the average conception of how difficult it is to get to North Korea is part and parcel of this larger set of misperceptions that we have about the country. And, I mean, there are basically 5 to 10 travel organizations that exclusively go to this country. You just pay them a couple $1,000s, then go on kayak.com, get a reasonably priced ticket to Beijing, and you just fly to Beijing, and they take care of the rest of it.
They all leave from there, though.
You can only get there from Beijing.
I see. So are you getting on one of these formerly Soviet airplanes or what have you? Like, when does the experience of going to North Korea change from a normal flight experience or a normal travel experience? When is that point where it's like, oh, here we go?
Well, for us, actually, it was the North Korean airline insists upon feeding you a meal regardless of what time in the day it is.
Oh, sure.
So we got there, and I think we fly out at 2 or 3 o'clock. And within 10 minutes, they serve you a full meal on the plane, which I have purely out of intellectual curiosity, but it's as bland. It's as much of a crime against the culinary arts as you'd imagine. And so you hear about that, and then that in addition to the fact that they don't play the most recent hit rom-com on the in-flight airplane TVs. They play like really boring military symphonic performances that are, I mean, I don't speak Korean, but you get a pretty clear sense of what it is that they're talking about, because it's like only 4 or 5 things that these people are allowed to talk about.
Right, yes.
Exalting the greatness of X, Y, or Z.
I studied Korean myself, and I would be happy about that. That'd be a good way to learn, but they speak in this they have a weird, like everybody speaks as if they are addressing another member of the military, which I guess makes sense, huh?
Yeah, it's tough. I had some difficulties finding a translator because in the film I interview a North Korean defector who lives in Maryland, and I needed to get a translator, and there was a couple people that were native South Korean speakers that couldn't, with sort of reliable accuracy, say what a North Korean person is saying, because apparently the accent is so thick. And that stuff actually, I knew that was the case because there's this other literature that talks about North Korean defectors that go to South Korea and how tough it is for them to sort of ingratiate themselves in the community. And one of the reasons is because they're all so short, but another reason is because they have these incredibly thick accents that come with like all the social stigmas that you and I sitting here in Koreatown in Los Angeles would attach to like a heavy Southern drawl.
Right. And very archaic words as well, like words that aren't used anymore. And words that got replaced by Western loan words, to be honest, which they ain't having in North Korea, I take it.
Right. So the accent stuff is interesting, but there's a limited amount that I could appreciate that just because I don't know Korean at all. I have no aptitude for languages.
Well, you might have picked something up along this way, this whole Juche Strong way, or no?
Not really.
You got the word Juche, which is the important thing.
I did get the word Juche,
right. And you're now converted to believing in Juche and self-reliance and the glory of the Kims.
Oh, sorry. I guess I should have led with that. That's how the way that it ends.
Spoiler alert.
It actually is an agrarian utopia. I guess I should have led with that one.
This is what you're funding, listeners. By the way, so throw some Western non-counterfeit dollars this way. But do you land in Pyongyang or do you land somewhere weird? Like, how do you when you touch the ground in North Korea? What's the program?
Yeah, you land and it's only the Pyongyang airport. It's sort of in the middle of nowhere. I think it's about 30 to 35 minutes out of the actual major metropolitan area. And immediately when you get in there, though, you get precisely a version of what the North Korean version of fascism looks like, right? Which is like they have aspirations to be hyper-controlling and oppressive, but it's mostly done with incompetence and inefficiency. So the Pyongyang
combination.
At the Pyongyang airport, there you have to go through the security check, which of course it's like 3 1970 style security scanners, but each one of them has to be manned by no less than 8 military personnel, right? Because everybody needs a job in North Korea, not if everybody has work, right? And then you just exit out of there, and it's not as if there's a way that they're corralling you to make sure that you're only meeting up with your handlers. I mean, we kind of walked around a little bit, and everything's sort of surreal because you're finally there after having spent so much time thinking about the country. And then we kind of bumped into our handlers, and then you end up getting into the van and leaving. But it's not as if this is not like a Brave New World, like hyper efficiency of control of every micro movement that these, Yankee intruders are coming in. But I mean, part of that might also be that there's really nowhere you to go. You can't go, and you don't seamlessly blend into the local population.
No doubt. Did you have more moments of, yeah, this is North Korea, or, so that's North Korea? Like, did it align well with your research and what you knew beforehand, or were there more moments of incongruity?
It was basically, I'll say, the thing where you really know it's North Korea is when you get bored. All right? So you're there for 10 days, and you basically, after about maybe 3 days, you're like, I get it. Like, I get it. Like, Kim Il-sung, divine father figure, his spirit animates the country. He liberated you from the Japanese, and everything that's good in this world and in this country is a direct result of him or one of his kid. So everything they take you to has the exact same explanation, and then it's in combination with you can't leave your hotel. So you're deprived of the one thing that always makes travel the most interesting is spontaneous conversation with the locals. So at the point that you know precisely what your handler is going to say to you whenever you have a question, it at most has 2 degrees of separation from Kim Il-sung, and you can't leave and have unplanned or unmediated interactions with the locals.
None of the just aimless walking that traveling is for.
Exactly. At that point, you take to drink.
Yes.
At that point, you take to drink.
I'm sure they have a lot of soju there. I don't know if particularly good stuff there, but
it's mediocre. But even there, if you are a beer man like me and you need the beer to like squash your suffering and your sorrows for being there, they only have 2 options, and they literally, I think, are called just dark beer and light beer. So they have these placards that are the full menu, which is just a light beer and a dark beer, and that's the full set of options you have.
Is this maybe some like 4th tier Chinese beer they're bringing in, or what do you get the sense of what the light and dark beer are?
No, these are, and they are very emphatic about this. Although you're right, it potentially is a lie, but they're very emphatic that all this stuff is brewed locally in North Korea, and it's not bad. It's not bad, and
What's your preference, light or dark?
Oh, the light, of course, but they always are very good about giving it to you in ample quantities. But it's a limited set of options, and I think in my film also includes sort of an extended quotation from a radio interview that was done with Christopher Hitchens. He was always very good in his writing when he talked about North Korea, about that boredom component of it, that your life, to a certain extent, there's a certain nihilism that underlines everything when you're completely deprived of the ability of autonomous meaning creation and purpose providing. And that actually is just it's boring. Like it's weird to say that a country that is so fascinating and anomalous can be boring after being there for so long, but it's kind of an inevitability when so much of your life is controlled. And I would imagine that to a certain extent, that also parallels with the experience of the average North Korean, where, I mean, these people are human, they have families, and I think a lot of them do derive a certain sense of spiritual satisfaction from the narrative that is towed by the regime. Right. But at the same time, there's got to be large stretches of just boredom. And also because so many of them have to engage in manual labor. I mean, I'm sure that boredom permeates that culture in ways that are unique to a country that is so controlling when it comes to the narrative.
I would imagine, I mean, you said that there were those symphonic performances on the in-flight TVs flying in there. I'm surprised they had in-flight TVs, by the way. A little disappointed there were TVs in there. I was hoping they would roll down the screen at the front, like the 60s type projector. No, but I've watched a lot of North Korean TV dramas on YouTube and such, and I think B.R. Myers, when I interviewed him, said it best. He said, in North Korean TV dramas, it's a conflict between a perfect character and a slightly less perfect character, because of course they're both North Korean. You can't have a North Korean villain. You can't really have a North Korean conflict. But people are entertained by that, I guess. And that shows you, A, the depth of the boredom there. B, I guess we cured boredom in the developed world, didn't we?
Yeah,
it's maybe. Like tuberculosis. You don't get bored in America, right?
Well, this is going to maybe sprout off to a tangential conversation, but I think so. I think we cured it, but maybe in ways that are not particularly healthy. It's funny. So I'm in Los Angeles because I live and work in D.C., but my family's in L.A., and I've definitely noticed when I go outside of the rhythms I've established for myself in D.C. and I come to L.A. and things slow down a bit. And also, I'm happy to do some LA bashing from a DCer if need be.
Right. You can probably do both. You can probably go from both angles and bash both places.
Right. Well, yeah, I definitely am firmly... My allegiances now are on the East Coast. Wow. But I want to make it clear that's not a subchapter of Juche Strong. That's purely a hobby horse of mine. Sure. But there's a radical decrease in the stimulation. And, you're doing things with family, friends, and... You're being forced to engage in conversations where the other person is wholly uninformed about the public policy issue that they have strong opinions about.
Sure. Hearing some gun control conversations these days, I bet.
Oh, yeah. Or people still talk about Benghazi, a couple Benghazi conversations. They read one Bill Kristol article about it, and they think that they're moral geniuses. But I actually don't, and let's see if I can finally bring this back to the topic at hand. I don't like how much it irritates me and how tough it is for me to do that downshifting for stimulation. Mm-hmm. I wish that there was more of a Zen-like calm, and that that stuff is only really thrown into relief when I'm forced to extract myself from that environment. Right. And you definitely, with modern American technologies and wealth and affluence, can spend every day completely stimulated by something new and novel. Mm-hmm. But I know that it does fundamentally rework your brain chemistry and like your neural circuitry, but I actually don't think that it's healthy to be in that situation because you're so vulnerable to boredom the second that you no longer can operate within that constant stimulation stream.
Right.
I think it's related to North Korea. The only way to put this is going to be in ways that are so like incredibly obvious and commonsensical that hopefully I can get away with doing them because I'm going to preface them as such.
Sure. Nothing wrong with common sense, my friend.
But the things that actually provide like long-term satisfaction that are not wholly dependent upon your particular environment is this larger sense of purpose or community you can feel yourself embedded in. And the idea is that if you can give people that, and this is explicitly said in the film, if you can give people that, they're willing to forego a lot of the more kind of relatively superficial consumerist pleasures because the deeper, more core satisfactions have been provided for them. And I in no way romanticize North Korean life. I'm huge. I think I'm trying to combat misperceptions. One of the misperceptions I'm not trying to combat is that it's a horrible country that if it's possible to reform, I'd like to have reformed immediately. But it does speak to the fact that in some ways, some of those people have something that maybe a lot of people in sort of a modern Western economy don't have, which is a really firm and secure sense of place and purpose. And so if they've sort of, a really firm sense of place and purpose, and we're in a Western capitalist democracy, you're allowed to like choose your own adventure, but sometimes the process of choosing your own adventure can leave you kind of alienated or existentially aimless.
Right. Or you get to the page where you die.
Right, that's true.
So you got to go back and then try again.
Yes, that's true enough.
America provides second chances. That's the analogy.
How far do we want to push this?
We don't need to push it that far.
I don't actually want to push it any
That's
farther.
fine, because there's some comparisons I want to make between societies here. We mentioned we're sitting here in Koreatown where I live, and I think actually, so I mentioned studying Korean. There's some textbooks of the Korean language right there. We're going to Korean food with my Korean girlfriend later. So I have an interest in Korea, you might say, and specifically South Korea, because that's the one you can learn more about generally. But there are parallels between North and South. One is not so alien from the other. They haven't been divided that long, and it's hard to escape the fact, or the inkling that the North and the South are two sides of the same ideological coin, in that they're proud of their race, I guess you might say.
Yeah.
They have wanted to develop themselves, bring themselves up in the world, have a lot of ideas about the suffering that they've endured over the hundreds of years, thousands. But can I say that North Korea and South Korea chose different paths to express this same sort of core feeling? One just happened to choose the one where people get fed?
Yeah. So basically there's the two prongs of the film when it's talking about why this propaganda works. One part of it is it taps into some core universal psychological elements, and I think evolutionarily endowed cognitive impulses that are shared by all humans. But it's that, and the second thing is, though, there's also a very particular cultural history for the Korean Peninsula, and that in turn determines what kind of narrative is presented to the North Korean people. So I think on that second end, that shared history is common between both sides of the 38th parallel, and specifically that distrust of outsiders, and also a certain kind of xenophobia that I don't really think the average American can even fully appreciate. I don't know if there's anything like it, but I do know that South Korea is still an incredibly racist place. And the other kind of shared cultural history is this Confucianism. And I'd love to say that I understand Confucianism better than I actually do, but I do know that one of the core components is the notion of the sort of family as the key unit of the social structure in ways, again, that maybe the average American can't fully appreciate. And that particular aspect of the Confucian heritage of the family being the core social unit is absolutely still prevalent in South Korea. Specifically, all of the big name South Korean companies, Hyundai or Samsung, their board of directors are still all family relatives. So even at that level, even though they've adopted so much of the like Western capitalist garb, those cultural predilections still shine through, still manifest themselves.
I do see this. I do see the difference manifest itself specifically in even American-born Korean friends. We're two American-born white dudes from the West Coast. Our parents do not make rules for us. We're near 30, right? And if our parents made rules for us, we'd be like, what? Like we just, we just talk to the hand, right? 30-year-old Korean friends still follow their parents' rules, I find. And like as a white American parent, you'd be afraid that your kid would disown you at that point. But it's still like you've seen this in at least I assume some friends from East Asia, right? Like you've seen a rule get obeyed at an age that seems too late, and you're like, that is a little bit alien.
That family stuff is no joke. Yeah. I mean, it's really no joke. And the idea of the patriarch, that specifically, I think the thing I get less of is that, yes, someone just by where they happen to fall in the family structure, the mother or the father, that in and of itself is enough justification for them to have a certain level of respect or authority in the family. Right. I think that to a certain part is what you're speaking about. And that to me may be because I was born, in the 1980s, and we just killed off all our gods, or I'm the product of the generation that killed off all the gods, and one of those gods has got to be the parents.
Right.
That notion of the parents immediately being afforded respect or authority.
By definition,
over my life.
afforded respect. It's like, huh?
Right. It's like it's much more like merit-based,
Right,
and
yeah. I mean, I'm sure we respect our parents, but it's not because they're our parents.
right. It's because they do things that, yeah. I mean, I very much do, but I know that some of it is dependent upon the parents' sort of particular personal attributes and the way that they conduct themselves. It's not afforded automatically. And that notion of it's just a divine rule that's embedded in the universe, that this person who birthed you has this level of authority over you regardless of their sort of personality or behavior, that concept is foreign to me. And maybe that's a very, very American thing about just, sort of chopping off the heads of all power, including the parents.
Right. I'm pretty sure our parents' generation killed the god of the parents, though, so we can blame them, right?
Right. But we do need to eventually form a replacement deity, right? And I don't think an iPad...
So?
Is it an iPad?
It's probably an iPad.
It's something Steve Jobs thought of before he died, I'm sure. There's stuff in the pipeline. But another comparison between societies, the cut of Juche Strong I saw, it ends, or it almost ends, with this montage of American politicians all invoking God, and not just Sarah Palin, and not just Mitt Romney. Though I was surprised, I forgot Sarah Palin talked like that. How did we endure it? And I mean her accent specifically, not just the God stuff. But even Joe Biden, the repeated invocation of God. What do you make of something like that? Same root as the invocation of Kim Il Sung, or what?
Yeah, so part of what the kicker of the film, the thing that's really supposed to give you a karate chop to the genitals, is trying to do some broader critical theory work on American politics as well. So the natural extension of this is, if the North Korean people are not that strange from us, then the political rhetoric that is enabling the Kim family to maintain control might also share some similarities to the political rhetoric that's regularly deployed by American politicians. Now, there's no false equivalences here. There's no false parallels. I love America. It's an incredibly free place. But I do notice that some of my fellow creatures in this country are routinely cowed by very particular rhetorical tropes that absolutely bear genetic similarities to some of the rhetorical tropes that are deployed by the Kim family. Yes. And this is probably not going to make it into the final cut because none of the other people that I'm producing this film with find it compelling. But that thing where I've had to watch a bunch of speeches done at both this year's Republican National Convention and at the Democratic National Convention, and the idea that every single speaker at the very end of their speech has to ostentatiously say, "God bless America," I think is just, it's obnoxious. It's completely obnoxious. Yes. And you know for a fact that some of these people are effectively atheist or agnostic, but they do it because they have to do it. You have to have this commingling of religion and politics. And in part, you have to believe that American exceptionalism is divinely ordained. Like, that particular notion is an essential component if you want to be a thriving, successful politician in this country. I hate that stuff. I hate it so much. And there's no way that you can be denial of the fact that the exact same reason that a lot of Americans love that notion of Jesus having bestowed his blessings on this great land of ours bears striking similarity to the same reason why not a lot of North Koreans love the idea that they're a sort of uniquely, quasi-divinely ordained, exceptional race and breed of people. There's absolutely similarities there.
It reminds me, I mean, in the cut I saw, again, I'll preface it with this is in the cut I watched of Juche Strong, not completely done, but when Mitt Romney shows up, he's talking about God, but he also mentions, and this was a trope of his and of many politicians, that, America's glory days are coming back. In his speeches, I always thought, the implication here is that America is going to have to restart World War II and win it, because that's the only way America will be what it was before, is if literally World War II happens again and it wins, and it's the only non-impoverished country in the entire world at the end of it. And Mitt Romney has to know that's not true. Like, would you agree with that? You live in D.C., in the seat of our government. Like, Mitt Romney's not dumb. He clearly knew that those days were not coming back, right?
I'm sure that there was, like, one of his Bain affiliates drew up a PowerPoint presentation about all the particular narrative devices you need to deploy to make sure the NRA supports you. And so one of the other people that's a non-North Korean expert that I interview is a guy by the name of Jonathan Haidt, who's a big-time sort of evolutionary psychologist at New York University. And he's done a lot of fascinating work when it comes to the way that we go about processing the world, just human brains, and one of them is we love narratives and we love storytelling. And that gets reflected in the political rhetoric that is deployed against us in order to control us. And one of the big things that people will do is they'll tell this very particular story about a glorious, pure past that is then
relapse area.
Right, that is then shattered by some nebulous, all-present enemy. So we are the fall from innocence, but then the possibility or the hope of a restored utopian future. And oh, by the way, the guy that's going to get us there is the person who's speaking, right?
Can't forget that bit. That's
so
the clincher.
And that we know, I mean, analytically investigating that claim, historically inaccurate, historically false, but it has this incredibly intoxicating power for a lot of people to think about the world in those terms and the notion of redemption. And yeah, some of the clip that I use for Romney that is almost undoubtedly going to make it into the final cut is a very clear demonstration of that narrative tool in action in the most recent presidential campaign.
With all the God talk in American politics, I mean, you live in D.C., I've been there. It doesn't seem like a super God-fearing place. You know what I mean? It's the seat of the federal government, but I don't get the sense people are going around cowering in fear of God or loving Jesus or what have you. Not that it's Sodom and Gomorrah there. To break out another Bible reference I'm not entitled to use because I don't really know the context, but it's not like you're in the seat of religious America there, right?
Oh, I think it's a cynical manipulation of religious sensibilities.
Yes.
Don't get it twisted. Don't get it twisted. No, I mean, I know people that are political operatives within the Republican Party that are profoundly atheist. Disproportionately high slice of them are also gay, and they will absolutely recommend to whatever politician that they're working with that they talk about their strong Christian values and also that they make a point to speak about the gay menace. This, I think it's mostly a cynical manipulation because they think that they can very easily funnel votes to their chosen candidate by deploying these tools that the slack-jawed yokels will follow in lockstep. And frankly, I think that they're right in a lot of ways. I really do think that they're right, and I think that it doesn't take... I don't think you need to use particularly sophisticated rhetorical tools to tap into these forces that get the average American to be willing to throw themselves behind some politician.
This is energy that goes toward winning over the public, and some might say about North Korea, they don't need to win over the public because they've got them on lockdown. But it seems, watching Juche Strong, one realizes that North Korea spends more time and energy winning over its public, in some sense, right?
Right. Well, it's both the amount of energy they put into it, but also it's a different message. It's not comparable to other kind of parallel fascist regimes. And again, I can't speak too much about that stuff because I don't know enough about it, but a lot of the people that are used in my film speak to this, that there's some the way that the propaganda is structured and what it's saying to people is almost wholly unique in recorded human history. But it does spend a lot of time doing it, but it's also what specifically are you saying? And there's also some other tertiary evidence to indicate that it does genuinely work to keep people there. And one of my favorites, which is I think B.R. Myers probably talked about on the podcast, or he says in a presentation that's online, when people think of the Chinese and North Korean border, they probably think of the Berlin Wall. They think of some high barbed wire fence,
turrets, guns,
trenches. Yes.
They think of the North-South Korean border.
Exactly. So highly weaponized. Not at all. There's pictures of the river that separates the two countries. It's easily wadable, and large stretches of it are totally unpatrolled. And again, you don't want to go too far with this evidence, but it's not difficult from a physical standpoint. And also we have firsthand testimony from North Korean refugees that talk about how they got out of the country. It's not that difficult to physically extract yourself from the country, but the rate of refugees is much, much lower than you would expect. It's much, much lower.
There's also the "and then where are you" element to that. You're in a pretty rural part of China, right? At that point, you're not getting amenities in the area of China you wade into, right?
Right. And I mean, there's a lot of other complicating factors. The Chinese government and sort of local Chinese police forces oftentimes work on behalf of North Koreans to identify defectors and send them back. But I think there are similar historical parallels and you have seen a much higher rate of exit in those other countries than you see in North Korea, which lends itself to the notion that people are not leaving, despite the fact that it's constantly a famine state, in part because they feel as if they are they're an integral part of this grand social project.
Now, when the listeners fund the completion of Juche Strong on Indiegogo, which is going on now, as you listen to this, if you've listened in a timely fashion, you'll have the film completed. It'll get in front of eyes. Do you plan to continue your examination of North Korea in other forms and expanded film forms in any sense whatsoever, or are you done with the Hermit Kingdom?
So the honest answer that might get me in trouble is I'll do wherever I can get financing.
Sure.
So I mean, part of the reason that
any filmmaker's answer is that.
Right. So if you want to cut me a check to do a feature-length version of Juche Strong, I'll certainly reply to your text messages. So yeah, hit me up. But I like documentary filmmaking because it allows me to indulge in a lot of different intellectual interests. So I have a couple ideas for feature-length films that I'd like to do that have a similar sensibility and a similar sort of contrarian, dissident angle to them. Right. Of course, laced with the finest of hip-hop influenced music. Which is very much that's the auteur sensibility that I've decided to craft for myself. So I think ideally I'd like to take a lot of the tools and knowledge that I've learned from this process and apply it to a feature-length version about a couple key domestic policy issues. At the same time, I mean, yeah, if someone wants to give me $250,000 to make a feature-length version of this film, I'll absolutely do it. And I think when you see it, everyone who donates the bare minimum immediately gets a digital copy of the film. You'll see it and you'll know precisely what it is you're getting from me as far as the intellectual sensibility, the aesthetic sensibility, what angles I find interesting on the subject. I mean, it's all there. It certainly can serve as a marketing package as well.
Right. What else can you tell listeners about what they can get incentive-wise if they back the project?
All right, so at the $75 area, you can get an invitation to the premiere, but the real gold standard is the $125. You get the invitation to the premiere. You also get the digital download of the film, but you also get a special mini doc that I'm making that has a ton of footage that I took in North Korea that just didn't fit into the film. A lot of it stars me.
And they let you take footage there. I mean, some of the stuff I see is shot kind of sideways, like you maybe were not telling anybody you were shooting. Or
yeah, so there are things that I shot. You're not supposed to take shots of civilians. You're not supposed to take shots of military personnel. But again, as part of this broader, the theme in North Korea is, for at least Westerners, a lot of incompetent fascism. So they tell you not to take photos, but it's not particularly difficult to get footage of stuff that you're not supposed to get footage of. For me, though, I mean, one of the things that's going to be in this mini doc is they have this custom in North Korea where they get a bunch of clams and they pour gasoline on them and they light them on fire.
Oh, man.
Which apparently is considered a delicacy. Again, in North Korea, that's what passes for a culinary celebration.
Just confirm this for me. I hear that a foreigner in North Korea gets copious food, but very greasy and bland food as well. Was that true the whole time?
Yeah, they insist upon overfeeding you. You get 3 huge meals every day, and as expected, about 90% of it is bland. 5% of it is terrible. Basically anything that revolves around seafood. Right. And then 5% of it, every once in a while, you get the faintest glimmer of genuine pleasure being derived from the food. So that's what you get.
Have you read that? Have you read this in pre-war Korea? The North, the area that would be the North, would become the North, what was the place to eat? That was like the seat of culinary pleasure on the peninsula. Not so anymore, huh?
No, but they had this cold buckwheat noodle soup that was originated in North Korea and then has been like perfected and is quite popular in South Korea. It's like
naengmyeon is the name of that.
This is the sole like culinary contribution in North Korea. I've had it. It's terrible. It doesn't taste good at all. Like there's no amount of spices that you can put on that to interest me. So I think am appropriately underwhelmed by their culinary contributions. But I mean, the thing is, so I had this. It was supposed to be this group activity that we were going to do with the guides, but then every other person that was part of my group decided to decline. So I ended up sitting there with our guides, eating clams and drinking their soju, their vodka, and some of their finest light-colored North Korean beer. And then during this process, maybe 5 to 6 other guides that were staying at the same kind of hotel area came and joined us. So for a good hour or 2 hours, it was me and like 7 drunk North Korean dudes. And I took footage of the whole thing.
Oh, man. Listeners, you can get this.
That's all you got to do. $125. Just cut the check. PayPal me. And that's one of like the little vignettes that are going to be included. And but you know, part of the idea is like North Koreans unguarded will say crazy shit. Like a lot of them are convinced that reunification is within the decade. Inaccurate.
Reunification in that we're gonna take ourselves the South.
It's the way it's not necessarily aggressive. I think that it's just like maybe those like crazy Southerners will
they'll
realize they got
right.
it all wrong. They'll be the prodigal sons, and they'll be like, "Wait a minute, yes, please, like,
we'll welcome the South into our open arms.
Please take our iPhones and our absolutely atrocious pop music. We want to be unified under the warm bosom of the Kim family." So they'll say things like that I think they genuinely believe. But at the same time, and this is part of the point of the film, a super drunk North Korean talks about precisely the same things that a super drunk American in a Washington, D.C. dive bar talks about. Like women, professional struggles, anxiety. I mean, it's the same. These are human beings, right? Right. And that, I mean, there's a person in the film that explicitly says that, and you would think that it would be such an obvious thing to say it's not worth it. But again and again and again, when I see the coverage of the country or the way that the average American perceives this country, it is a radical statement to remind them that these are human beings just like the rest of us, that have the same neurological capabilities and have a conscious experience of the world, and we're just born into this environment, and many of them are doing precisely what we're doing, which is making the best of it that they can. Right?
And listeners can go where exactly to back this project?
Indiegogo.com/Juche Strong. Or you can go to juchestrong.com, so JUCHESTRONG.com. And yeah, so, and of course, I'm happy to answer any questions. All my contact information's up there. JucheStrong.com. I've been speaking here in Los Angeles' Koreatown with documentary filmmaker Rob Montz, whose Juche Strong is right now being Indiegogo funded to its completion. Back it. You'll get footage of drunken clam bakes. Not going to regret it. Rob, thanks so much. Thank you, Colin.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everybody who backed Season 3 on Kickstarter, including Paige Calvert, Jonathan Crow, Douglas Dollars, Paul Doyle, John French, Eric Graham, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Kimberly Hahn, Carl Haley, Stefan Halperin, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovanek, Mark Hines, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Matthew Lickey, Mr. Munvirzi, Rob Montz, Lindsay Muniak, Daniel Murphy, Aidan Millman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Blake Riley, Rob Schultz, Cam Smith, Small Demons, Todd Shimoda, Kevin Smokler, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.